Well, it's great to see everybody today. We're beginning our new series on Colossians. And as I have already mentioned, Colossians is quite an amazing book. It's one of the smallest letters in the New Testament, and yet it's one of the most profound. And I think you are going to find it be very important for strengthening your spiritual life. In fact, that's what it's really all about, is being spiritual. What in the world does being spiritual mean? When you hear the word natural, or maybe the word environmental, or the word biological, all these words in English that end with "al," what does that mean? I think we all know that to be natural means to be associated with what nature. Uh, to be environmental is mean you're going to talk about something that's about the environment. To be floral, you're going to talk about flowers. So the AL in English is an ending to our words that we want to say that this thing is like what precedes it, or it's associated with it somehow. So the word spiritual literally has the meaning of that which is like or associated with, connected to the spirit world, spiritual. In fact, when you look up in the Greek language the word spiritual, the word spirit is pneuma, the wind of the breath, the pneuma. But if you want to say spiritual, they tag on the TI and the idea of the same thing. It's that which is related to, like, or connected to the spirit world, or the spirit himself, or the spirit itself, depending on how it is used. So, in this study of Colossians, I just want to begin by saying it is a fabulous letter. I think it's probably for many people, it's the most important book outside of the Gospel of John. It's the most important book to us to understand the nature and the purpose of Jesus coming to this world. In fact, I was reading one of my favorite theologians is a great fella who's written so much for us over the years, a fellow named John Stott. And here's what John Stott says about Colossians. He says, uh, it is Colossians is the most Christ-centered of all of Paul's writings. It's the most Christ-centered, and we're going to see what that's about. And I'm telling you, this book is extremely important to you and me because it gets to the core of what Jesus came here for, what God the Father did when he sent Jesus. It's here to help you with the things that are going on around you and in your own interior life. Because here's what I want you to know, the whole New Testament spends a lot of times talking about spiritual things and to talk about you being a spiritual person and how you can be more spiritual and not so much natural. That you are both natural and spiritual, but how can you be spiritual? And what does it mean in this crazy day in which we live? Did you know uh, Colossians is really about two things? One, it's about what does it mean to be spiritual and how can you be spiritual in the mind of God? And secondly, how is it that Jesus is so important to your becoming spiritual, having spiritual wisdom, spiritual understanding, spiritual leadership? So you can see on a practical level, this is really at the core of what we as Christians stand for, is being spiritual. Now, today, of course, we're going to be a little shorter in our lesson, but that's okay. We're going to take our time. We're not going to be in any hurry on this study of Colossians. We're just going to take it piece by piece, and where we leave off, we'll pick up again next week. I think it's just going to be a very rich and I hope a very good time for discussion. Um, I was reading a survey back in 2023, and it's the same kind of thing now. This survey I really like because it's by the Pew Research Center, as many of you know, is one of the most respected uh, 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 kind of polls centers in America. And Pew reported then that in surveying Americans, a major random study of Americans, it found out that 34% of American adults believe in a spirit, in a spirit other than God. In other words, they said, yes, they believe in something out there in the universe or someone out there in the universe. They believe there is something or someone, but they do not believe in the biblical idea of a God or of a heavenly father, of an old man in the sky, is the way they put it. They believe that the spirit that operates the universe and that you and I have to deal with daily and after we die, this spirit is more of a universal consciousness, or it's more of a kind of an energy out in the universe. And we know there is energy out in the universe. We know it from all different sources. The reason I brought that up is that I'm sure either you've had to deal with it or maybe you have relatives or friends who are dealing with this subject of maybe it's better to just talk about the universal spirit, that whenever we die, we're going to all be a part of the universal spirit. It doesn't make any difference whether you're any religion or no religion at all. We're all going to die and don't make any difference about our existence here. We're going to be absorbed into the universal. And all this talk about heaven and hell and going to be with our family and friends and all that is an old poetic way of talking about the same thing, many will say. This 30, 34, that's a third of our nation. The people are saying, and some of them won't say that to you, but they would say it to an anonymous person, somebody they didn't know. I believe in the spirit world, but I don't believe in the biblical concept of spirit. So I think this is something for us to consider because even though you and I, as Christians, have this very personal view that we do our intellect, those of you who give thought to these kind of things, in your intellect, you sometimes are either tempted by Satan or just your human nature. You say to yourself, how can how can the creator of the whole universe, the creator of the world, how can someone that big be brought down into some human form like Jesus? How can that be? How can there be? Maybe that's really not true. Maybe there's just a spirit. Maybe when we die, everybody, I know Phyllis was telling me she was talking to an old friend of ours a good while back, and this person was a dedicated churchgoer. And this person said, well, everybody's going to go to heaven. Everybody's going to be together because we're all going to be a part of that spiritual world. Well, how in the world do we as Christians, followers of Jesus, the Messiah, the Master, how can we not try and change everybody else's mind, but how can we feel secure with this big question? Phyllis, would you read the Colossians 1? When we start Colossians, this is kind of our focal passage where Paul says what's on his mind. What is Paul worried about here in Colossians 1:9?
Paul says, we ask God to give you complete knowledge of His will and to give you spiritual wisdom and understanding.
Spiritual wisdom and understanding. Whoa, wouldn't you like to have spiritual, that is, having understanding, having wisdom, making decisions? Wouldn't you have that is like the Spirit Himself? I think that's the goal of every one of us, isn't it? That we would know, try and know the will of the Spirit of God, try and know the pleasure of God, trying to know understand what he wants us to do. Isn't that what we want? That's exactly what Paul talks about in most of his letters, is that we not be ruled, our minds, our bodies, our attitude, our decisions, to not be ruled by our natural animal fleshly instincts, but that we be different. And we know that's what happens to people who turn to Jesus. But this week, Phyllis and I watched a YouTube podcast by Oprah Winfrey. Maybe some of you seen it. It's kind of a popular thing. Millions of people are watching it now. It was a podcast with this fellow, Bruce Grayson, who is a psychiatrist from the University of Virginia, a very well-respected university. And he is noted by some as the world expert on they call it near-death experience. Basically, it's life after people who die and then come back. And in fact, over the years, he's interviewed hundreds of people who report having gone to the other side, as he calls it, going to the afterlife, and have come back to report what they experienced. And I won't take the whole time. I just want to tell you, when we watch this, it's nothing new to me. I have been reading about it for years, and probably some of you have too. But the report says basically that when you start asking people all around the globe, whether they're Americans in the South who believe they go and meet Jesus and meet their family and friends, or whether they're Chinese and maybe they have no religion at all, maybe they're from some Muslim country and they have an experience with the spirit world. It's very interesting that all of them have some things in common. They have some kind of feeling that there is more, that there's no time, and that things are beautiful and there's so much love and all. And some of them express these things, and yet they're not Christian. They're not even talk about God or heaven or anything. They just have an experience. And then some people have this very wonderful reunion with Jesus and with all those that mean something to them. What I discern from this thing to me is that there's still great interest in the spirit world and in the influence of that which is not just the created order. It's like even scientists today are recognizing significantly, like for instance, in the field of medicine, most all of the respected experts in the field of medicine are saying there is something more than just the biological. And so we're we're dealing now in this study of Colossians. We're dealing seriously with how do you, at your best, as you're growing up as a Christian, trying to be a little more mature than a child, how are you to face a world where you don't just have Christian people around you who believe in the biblical language and who believe in the reality behind it? How are you able to face these things? It kind of reminds me of when Paul went to Rome. You remember the first time he was there. He went up on Mars Hill. Some of you have been there. I've been there. Stood there on that same rock where Paul stood, and he looked over into Athens and looked across to the head of the government and all those sites. And he stood there on that hill, famous for debate, famous for discussion. And Paul said to those people, they invited him to bring his ideas, they said. They wanted to debate what he had to say. They said to him, "Tell us, what do you believe? What is all this talk about?" And Paul said, "Well, I first of all want to say I'm very impressed with how religious you people are. You folks are so intellectual. In fact, you built tombs and you built big monuments to all these gods. But the one that I noticed that I liked the most was that you built a monument to an unknown God." He said, "But I want you to know I'm very impressed with all your interest in the spirit world. But I want to tell you that I have come to find who this unknown God that you have is. He is known. He has made himself known. He's revealed himself to us. And I'm going to enlighten you about who he is. He came in the form of a baby, and his name is Jesus. And if you want to know spiritual wisdom and understanding, then you need to turn to Jesus and you'll get to know who the creator is because he was there in the creation. I mean, Paul is saying to those intellectuals, all of those intellectuals of Athens, I'm come to tell you the truth. You see, the Greeks started it, and then the Romans picked up on it that there is truth. And that is that word aletheia in the language. It means that which is real, not fake, that which you can count on, that which is dependable. It doesn't change. I don't care if you're a Greek or a Roman or a Jew. Truth is that which you can count on, is not going to change on you. He said, I've come to tell you what that is and who that is. And so, what he's doing here is he's saying to those people in Rome the same thing Paul repeats to the Colossians. So, the thing that we're going to be doing in this letter, that Paul is going to be answering this question: can you be spiritual without being religious? Can you be spiritual without even knowing Jesus? Now, I know that in our culture, it's not popular to say that we as Christians have got the final word. It's not a popular thing for you to do. It's much more popular to be tolerant and to say everybody has their own religion and everybody has their own understanding of God, and let's be nice. Paul wasn't a very nice guy when it came to this. But I want you to be asked the question when you start studying Colossians. I want you to ask the question, can you be spiritual? Of course, for those of you who are thinking ahead, you realize that what I'm saying is this book is going to help us understand our meaning of spiritual. Obviously, the word spiritual can mean different things to different people, but in the Bible is saying if you really want to be like the Spirit, you really want to be connected to the spiritual, you want to be connected to, you want to have a good understanding of the Spirit. Spiritual does not mean anything. Spiritual means something very specific about the true and living Spirit of God, who in the very first few sentences of Genesis, it talks about the Spirit of God hovering over. So, from the beginning of creation until the new creation, there is emphasized in God's word this whole idea of you and me being spiritual. I just have to tell you, all of my adult life, I've struggled with how to be spiritual. To what does it mean to be spiritual? If the Bible says that's what God wants us to be, and if it really means that one of these days when we die, we know we're going to have a spirit existence and not a physical existence, it's important to know what does that mean for now. So that's what this letter and this study is really all about. Now, we often talk about we have a new problem in this country and in our churches, and that is that this idea of being spiritual. Now the pop word, and it has been for a number of years now, the pop word is spirituality. If you were to write a book in religion these days, one of the categories that they'll use to promote it is spirituality, a whole category. Anything that has to do with religion, spirituality. So the question is, if we're talking about spirituality, what are we talking about? What are we talking about? And I'm going to ask each of you to realize that Paul was very concerned about the spirituality movement in his day. The new spirituality movement in our day is very much the same as the spirituality movement in Paul's day. He talked about it in a number of his letters. And Colossians is the clearest. He talks about it in Ephesians, he talks about it in Philippians, he talks about it throughout the New Testament. but he doesn't. You don't see the word itself, but in the Greek language you see it because it's talking about pneumatiko, which is a it's like saying spirit owl, spiritual like spirit. So as we go through this book, we're going to be going through it word by word, and we're going to be looking at it. What does it mean to you and me? So grab hold. You might want to enjoy reading Colossians and some different translations, and to get the richness out of this little short letter, uh, because I'm going to start and go through it word by word, phrase by phrase, to try and get the most out of it that we can. But before we do, we got to understand what we're reading. I think it's important that you don't just jump in and start reading, but you realize who wrote it, you realize what they were facing, what were they trying to do, who were these people they were talking to, because it doesn't mean as much if you don't. So, uh, Paul was facing a sense of people being called to be spiritual, but it was totally different than what he felt Jesus told us to be. In fact, he warned the people in Colossae, which is the town that the letter to the Colossians was written. In Colossae, there was a bunch of people who were confusing the new Christians. You realize this letter was written, probably only some 60 years after Jesus rose from the grave. I'm sorry, 30 years. Just 30 years after Jesus rose from the grave. In other words, quickly after Jesus was gone, people started making up things about was this fellow really what he says, or was he? It just can't be. It doesn't make any sense. So the intellectuals had a serious problem with saying he was who he said he was. And so they began to say that he was not what he said he was. And so Paul was going to warn them. Let me just give you a little taste of what he said that we're going to be studying. Phyllis, I've asked Phyllis to read this for me. Um, to the Colossians, in his letter, Paul warns the Colossians of this new kind of spirituality. Phyllis, would you read those that same verse, Colossians 2:20, 2:8, from the Message and also the NIV? Oh no, the NTL. I think you need to turn on your speaker.
This is
Okay.
from the New Living Translation. Don't let anyone capture you with empty philosophies and high sounding nonsense that come from human thinking and from the spiritual powers of this world rather than from Christ. And then from the Message, Bill and I mentioned this morning. I don't know if any of you all saw that little video that was going around, went viral a couple of years ago, about the little Hispanic boy that was in trouble with his mama, and she was scolding him, and he kept saying, "Listen, Linda, listen, listen, listen to me, Linda." Peterson should have said that right here at the beginning of this verse. Listen, people, listen. Watch out for people who try to dazzle you with big words and intellectual double talk. They want to drag you off into endless arguments that never amount to anything. They spread their ideas through the empty traditions of human beings and empty superstitions of spirit beings. But that is not the way of Christ.
All right. Did you know that one of the neighboring towns to Colossae was Ephesus? And he wrote the Ephesians and so forth. Well, in the book of Acts, where it's recorded of Paul making all these different journeys, one of those places that's talked about is Ephesus. And Paul said these things to the Ephesians, which are very similar to what he's saying to the Colossians. And let me tell you why. Because the Romans, the culture spreading into all the different churches, was plagued by this new sense of spirituality, which was anti-Christian. So, what did Paul say, Phyllis, to the church in Ephesus about this problem?
Dr. Luke writes this in Acts 20, verses 29 and 30, and I'm reading from the Message. Paul's words, I know that as soon as I am gone, vicious wolves are going to show up and rip into this flock, men from your very own ranks, twisting words so as to seduce disciples into following them instead of Jesus. So stay awake and keep up your guard. Remember those 3 years I kept at it with you, never letting up, pouring my heart out with you, one after another.
Well, some of us may sit back and say, well, this is no big deal. But let me tell you something. To some of us, and Paul at the front of the line says, this is a big deal. This is a very big deal. Because here's the question I want you to think about seriously as we move into this. Can I be spiritual? Can my children, can my friends, can they be spiritual without Jesus? When I wrote this lesson and this series, if I were writing a book, the title I have given it is The Seduction of Being Spiritual Without Jesus. It's a very real thing because, folks, there are more books on Amazon about spirituality that does not need Jesus than there are about being spiritual through Jesus. So we need to pay attention to what Paul was seeing was a serious problem. And now the reason he knew about it, let's say right from the beginning, Paul had never been to Colossae. He didn't know these people. He just heard word about them as people came by and told him what was going on in the different churches throughout Europe and Asia. And one of his fellow that he had trained, his name was Epaphras. Epaphras was a trainee of Paul, and he had gone and started a church in Colossae. And so the church sent him to Rome, where Paul was in prison, to help probably take him some supplies and visit with him and help him out in any way he could. So when he went, I'm sure Paul said to him, what's going on in the church there? And Epaphras told him that there were some intellectuals who were coming in and saying, let me help you with this. Now, it's all right to be a follower of Jesus, but let's be realistic. Jesus was not who he said he was. Jesus was just a good man, a good teacher, a great sacrificer. He is a saint if there ever was one. But let me tell you what it means to be spiritual. And so Paul is getting this from his friend who is saying, I need to take something back to these people. They need help to get strengthened in their faith and strengthened in their ability to withstand all of this misleading stuff. I don't know what to tell them. So Paul sat down and wrote a letter to the church back there for him to carry when he went back. And it's the letter we call Colossians. Now, remember this, that in those days, letters had to be written by hand. They didn't have a computer. It was written by hand and it was put on parchment and wrapped around. He'd carry that parchment with him. And typically a church would get it and they would copy it. And then they would send it on to some of the other, because all these other churches needed this letter. So what we're getting is the word that Paul himself wrote or had his friend handwrite it for him. But Paul taught this straight out. And let me tell you something. This is not something that happened hundreds of years later. This is something that happened not long. You realize it's only about 30 years since Jesus died and rose again. Paul had it fresh on his mind. It's just a few years since Paul met Jesus on the road to Damascus. Paul could never forget the spiritual experience he had on the road to Damascus, where he met Jesus and talked to him. And friends, 30 years is not a lot of time. I mean, some of you sitting here today can remember vividly where you were when the 9/11 happened. You can see those pictures in your mind. Do you realize that that's the length of time, about the same amount of time since 9/11 to us, as that experience that Paul had whenever he met Jesus and when he got the news of all these events that happened and acts that happened with Jesus when he was here on earth. So Paul's not talking about some old philosophy. He's talking about a personal experience, and that not just his, but the experience of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John and Peter and all these fellows. So what we're going to read here is not just Paul's opinion. This is the opinion and the witness of all these people who are trying to help us see. I don't care what these powerful Romans and Greeks and all these people, I don't care what all these mystical religions coming from the East in here to sell their products. I don't care what they said. I'm going to tell you the truth. I'm going to tell you what it really means to be spiritual. So, Ephesus, the founder of the church, the companion of Paul in the prison, and the pastor of not only Colossae, but it tells us in Philemon, it tells us that he had been a pastor of a number of churches in that area, which was common in those days for a man to take on several churches because they didn't have enough to go around. Now, as we look at this main issue, I like to call the core issue. The core issue of this is that we must understand the importance of being spiritual uh, without Jesus. Is that possible? Can people really find a spiritual life by just doing the things that we're taught? Um, Let me ask you this way. If someone were to ask you, what are the consequences? What happens to people who try to be, we'll call it spiritual, who try to be spiritual but don't believe in Jesus, who try to be a spiritual person without believing the Bible? Would any of you just tell me briefly, what do you think are some of the consequences to those people's lives and minds and thinking? Who'll go first?
No, listen, Roger, I think of the Jews as someone who would consider themselves spiritual because, like I read the Old Testament, see, there's plenty of evidence of that, and yet they didn't believe that Jesus was who he said he was. So we're not just talking about some new age ideas about people who think they're spiritual without Jesus. But I think that in Colossians, in that first chapter, three things stand out to me. And that is that Paul speaks about the Trinitarian God, that one gives us the ability to love others. Secondly, the Trinitarian God, which gives us wisdom and understanding, and the Trinitarian God, which gives us the power to be patient and have forbearance. Okay, so I know plenty of people who don't believe in any higher power, who don't believe in any spirit. My belief, though, is if someone, even if they start just in believing spirit, they have put themselves on the right road. And if they will seek God, the Trinitarian God will find them. And look at C.S. Lewis. Look at the path that he took. You seek God and you will be revealed the true God, which is the God, the Trinitarian God of Father, Son, and Spirit. So, yeah, I think that that doesn't speak directly to your question, but as long as you're seeking, he will find you. So I don't say, don't, it just don't make, I think the key thing is don't make up your mind that you know everything. Then you will stop seeking.
Yeah, thank you. That's great, Roger. I'm with you because our business is not to condemn anyone. As Jesus even said, I didn't come to the world to condemn them because they're all messed up. I came to help them. And so I think you're right. Not being a critical, condemning person of all other religions and all other seekers is foolish. What we're trying to do is what Jesus, he's our model. But when you see a young person or a young couple who says, I'm giving up on the church, I'm giving up on Jesus, that just doesn't make any sense how God can come to the earth. I just don't get it. I don't believe in it. Now I do believe in being spiritual. I do believe in thinking of things more spiritual, like my inner life and the cosmic forces and the energy of the world that scientists realize are there. What do you think if they don't find God, if they keep on this track of trying to survive and be prepared for the afterlife, have any of you experienced it, or what do you think is going to happen to these young people or young married people or even the middle-aged people who really have convinced themselves that you can be spiritual and be happy and be successful in your life and you don't really need Jesus?
Bill, this Nan,
Yeah.
I would say that, I mean, I know people say, oh, they're spiritual, and a lot of times that has to do with nature. They get out, they see a beautiful sunset or something like that, and it gives them this feeling, and they say they're spiritual, and that's true, but I think the difference is that that doesn't affect their lives, really. It doesn't change their lives like knowing Jesus does. In other words, they can have that spiritual high in a way, and then that's it until the next time, and it doesn't affect how they live.
Yes. What else? Somebody else. What are the consequences if you run down that road, Phyllis?
I like what Ann said, and I would add to it, when that young couple faces some hard times, and we all face them, there is no anchor. There is no person. We are without Jesus, without a relationship with Him, because God created us for a relationship with Him. And without that, we're like a ship with no anchor, and we're just blown about, drifting through life without purpose and without help and without hope.
Anybody else have a thought? Thank you, Phyllis. That's great.
Vicky, I totally, in fact, I was gonna say exactly what Phyllis said, but to add to that, all of us in this room have experienced, because of our age probably, experienced some horrific things in our lives. And in all of that, I think each of us would say that we could find peace, that we couldn't understand where it came from. We could find peace without understanding when we asked for it, and sometimes when we didn't ask for it. And the fellowship of other believers that come together and help us during those difficult times. It's those kind of things that I believe as Christians and believers in Jesus Christ that we have, that people that say that they're just spiritual don't have that.
Well, thank you very much. And, our time is up. And as I said, we're going to just pick up as we finish up. And next time, we're going to be talking about some things that help us be prepared to get the most out of Colossians. And thank you for your insight this morning. And I hope you'll read Colossians and just get some of the foretaste. Ralph?
Gosh, Bill, just what a great tease. Just as we're getting into the meat of it, okay, our time is up, okay, and Becky and Blanche, we're cutting a little short today because we're doing a tree dedication for Pastor Beverly Burke, and Lance sent out a link to that. If you'd like to join us, because you'll be able to see it on Zoom as well. If you'd like, about 10:30.